Welcome everyone to the APS panel on Preventative Control Plans and the Need for HACCP. What better way to start a cannabis conference than a discussion surrounding product safety and quality? It's 2021, and I think the industry has had some time to mature and develop alongside a consumer base, and brands that have had any proven success have really had to demonstrate product quality and safety as two significant pillars in their platform. And with the introduction of Cannabis 2.0 products, licensed producers dealing with extracts and edibles have had to demonstrate their commitment to product safety through preventative control and hazard analysis. And many items from other industries, such as the food industry, where they're developing things like food safety culture and new ways to mitigate risk, have really crossed over to the cannabis space more and more. I'm your moderator, Cory, Philion, and I'm joined today by two industry professionals by the name of Troy and Atiyyah, both of which have really strong backgrounds in working and educating clients within the cannabis space alongside other industries in which they support various functions ranging from quality assurance, regulatory, all the way to biosecurity and tissue culture. Personally, I have experience in the cannabis space as quality assurance person in support of Cannabis Edibles, and more recently I joined a food tech company in which preventative control and HACCP is really a daily focus. So I'm very excited to be here during this time together, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the two respective approaches of PCP and HACCP, some regulatory requirements, and some similarities and differences between the two. Having said that, let's get the conversation started with Troy and Atiyyah. How are the two of you guys doing today?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks for the great intro.
Yeah, doing well, Cory. Thanks a lot.
Great. Firstly, I figured our audience is eager to understand the difference. And admittedly, even when working in cannabis and food, you sometimes need a reminder. What exactly is the difference between HACCP and PCP?
So when looking at the differences between a PCP or preventive control plan and kind of what that entails and sort of what HACCP is as well, a preventive control plan by definition is a written document that demonstrates how hazards in your products are identified, as well as prevented, eliminated, or reduced to an acceptable level. So for example, anything could be considered a hazard, but typically they fall into the categories of biological hazards, like things like pathogenic bacteria, physical hazards, so any foreign objects in your product, and chemical hazards, which can be undeclared allergens or things like, chemicals such as cleaning chemicals that aren't supposed to be there.
No, that's great. Troy, do you have anything to add to that, or is that basically sum it up?
That's it. Yeah, that's great.
I think the preventative control plan was recently or originally introduced to complement the Food Safety Modernization Act in the States, and it's a bit more forward facing. And even though HACCP was designed to be preventative in its own way, I feel like it's a bit more reactive. So you get a little bit more forward facing written procedures in place with the preventative control plan. And now that we've differentiated the two, I would like to speak briefly to the context of PCP and the regulated environments of cannabis. With the introduction of Cannabis 2.0 products, Health Canada, like I briefly mentioned, chose to incorporate preventative controls from the food regulations, and which had recently saw a remodeling of its own in 2019. From what you've encountered with working with clients in both industries, what are some of the differences and unique challenges that you're seeing when implementing PCP in a food facility as opposed to one that's tailored for cannabis products? And are there any unique challenges from a regulatory perspective?
Sure, I can take this one first. I think from what I've seen, one of the biggest backgrounds is honestly getting that whole team together, like assembling your team. Whenever you're kind of identifying those hazards, you want to have a bunch of different eyes looking at it from different areas. And a lot of these cannabis companies, from my experiences, people are kind of wearing different hats every day. Let's say maybe you want someone from maintenance. You might not know who that person is, or that person might have just changed roles and it might be high turnover. So having people in the right roles who are familiar with their jobs and their department, kind of, starting that hazard analysis there, because I've seen some hazards overlooked, that if someone from that department was there when they're to be identified, that was something that would have came up and they could have had a plan for that.
Yeah, and I find that I guess some of the issues or challenges that I tend to notice is that there aren't a lot of people in the cannabis industry that have come from a background where doing these sort of things is second nature. So when you've come from a food background, and I did a lot of food quality and regulatory before I transitioned, these things are kind of, just an automatic thing that you do in every single process, and it feels very natural. So sometimes I find it challenging when I work with, new quality assurance staff that haven't had that same experience. They've either come from, just another industry altogether that doesn't have the same procedures, that things can sort of be overlooked. So it's really important if you're the more experienced person putting together a PCP or a HACCP plan, for example, that you sort of go through all the steps really one by one with the whole team. And as Troy mentioned, having a multidisciplinary team is really, really key. That's something that's definitely been adopted from the food industry, making sure that you don't just have people that are kind of off the floor making all the protocols and procedures and identifying hazards, because the individuals that are there day in, day out, they see things that you don't, and they can be a really big help in identifying kind of blind spots that you might not be able to notice.
Yeah, that's a great point. Comprehension at the floor level is really imperative when focusing on your employee training programs, and which translates directly to the fluidity of your processes. So getting procedures written, approved, in practice to start developing those practices, those good production practices from the beginning is very imperative. A third question for you guys: in your experience, what are the timelines you have seen in terms of licensed producers either having to strengthen their current QMS, whether they want to branch out into new product categories, as opposed to building it out from scratch? Like, say it's a new applicant and they're looking to build out their food safety or preventative control plan from scratch. What are the different challenges and timelines that you're noticing between the two?
Building out a PCP is something that is so organization specific, and so it really depends on that team's level of experience. Even if it seems like it's a relatively simple revamp, it can actually be quite a lengthy process. It really depends, like how many new ingredients are coming into play here. Is it an entirely new production line that we're looking to do a revamp on? For example, if someone is adding on like an entirely new product line, like they're adding in chocolate lines and they have like a lot of new equipment, that might actually take a lot longer than somebody that's developing the PCP plan for the first time that's only doing a single SKU. So this is a really, situational specific kind of answer, but I've seen them, as fast as 6 months, and I've seen some that take a year or two. And the other big challenge, I think, is that PCPs are like a living, breathing thing. So you're never like really done with it. So it's like the timeline, realistically speaking, is like the entire life like of your business, essentially, as you kind of mold and change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does take time to really encompass a preventative control plan that gives you that full coverage. So patience is mandatory, and you might see a lot of revisions, but ultimately you'll with more revisions and more employee training, you'll get a more solid protection ultimately. So regardless of which industry you're working in, I think we can all agree that sanitation programs are imperative in ensuring the safety and success of any process flow, leading ultimately to the final release of a product. How are PCPs and sanitation programs distinct, and how do they overlap? What are some of the common goals between these two entities?
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess the common goal for both of those programs is to ultimately have a safe product, maintaining the quality, contamination. But they do overlap quite a lot. If you're trying to prevent, an outbreak of powdery mildew, your preventative control might be sanitizing or disinfecting the room between crops. Or if you're trying to prevent outbreak of, let's say, coronavirus in your facility, maybe your controls are going to be disinfecting high-touch surfaces 3 times per day or whatever that might be. So it's really a tool in the toolbox you can use. But on the other side of the coin, you have to also have controls for, let's say, on contact surfaces. You have to make sure that your disinfectant or your chemicals are rinsed off in order it's not going to contaminate your product. So it does have both ways. And one way you're using it in an aid of your program. On the other side, you have to make sure that it's not leaving any contaminants on your surfaces, and as a result could be a hazard.
Right. And certainly the complexity of the number of different SKUs can really kind of impact and tailor your sanitation program, whether it's the frequency, overall monitoring of the master sanitation schedule. It depends quite largely on the number of SKUs and the complexity of products that you're dealing with.
For sure. Even if you're going to like extracts or anything like that, or into the food, you know, it's a lot different environment than if you're trying to clean a cultivation facility than you are edibles or extraction in general. The soils there are different. You should have different protocols and, you know, different plans.
So lastly, I just wanted to ask the two of you what resources are available to access that you can suggest for companies or individuals even to utilize when beginning to develop or strengthen their preventative control or hazard analysis. I know Health Canada has a plethora of guidance documents, but do you have any suggestions in particular as to where clients or companies can go to really get a more thorough understanding of what they're up against in terms of good production practices and preventative control?
I think that because, you know, we talked about it a bit earlier, but obviously PCP and these kinds of requirements have been adopted from food. So the CFIA, for example, is a huge resource that has so many different things available. It's quite funny to me, actually, that Health Canada doesn't directly just link to the CFIA, because that's where they took the PCP from. It's from the SFCR, the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. So, you know, the Safe Food for Canadians regulations does have some additional parts of their preventative control plan that you wouldn't have to cover under the PCP for the Cannabis Act. So things along the lines of consumer protection and market fairness, but there are tons of resources on the CFIA website for, you know, a step-by-step on how to implement your HACCP plan, full HACCP plans completed with examples. Same things for your PCP, you know, what are the main steps of the PCP, identification, stuff like that. The other resource that I really recommend, and I use myself all the time, is the RDHI, so the Reference Database for Hazard Identification. That's a really fantastic resource. Mostly for me, I use it when I have ingredients in an edibles product that I'm looking at going through. They're not always like super specific. They're not going to have every ingredient under the sun, but they can definitely highlight some hazards under all three fields, physical, chemical, and biological, that you might not have picked up on your own. So I think those resources that are very well known in the food industry are a great asset to anyone in the cannabis industry who's kind of starting off for the first time or looking for some more information than what Health Canada's offered.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the AEPS might have a course as well, and they definitely have some information. So they're the one hosting it. Might as well give them a shout out as well.
I teach that course. I really should have mentioned that. Yes.
Wow. So contact Atiyyah then.
I would like to elaborate a little bit more on, you had mentioned, Atiyyah, the kind of the differences between PCP as written or suggested by the CFIA and what exactly how it's been encompassed in the form of the Cannabis Act. There's a pretty significant difference, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, so I mean, if you kind of look at them side by side, they're not like quite the same. I mean, generally speaking, the preventative control plans have the same core, which is obviously that they're based on internationally recognized principles for hazard identification, but there are quite a few differences between the two. So, I mean, I'm kind of curious to see how many more of those things will be adopted over time into the cannabis industry, because, you know, with the things like the big things for me that the SFCR has, it's very unique, and in comparison to even like HACCP, those particular things that it covers, like standards of identities and grades and stuff like that, I'm actually really surprised that we haven't seen that transition over yet into cannabis, because obviously cannabis does have several regulations that are, you know, similar, that have a lot of consumer protection aspects to it. So I think a lot of us in the quality side of cannabis have been sort of just like placing bets on what we think is going to move over in the next cannabis regulations from food. So even something like HACCP, for example, it's not required that you have a HACCP certificate right now in cannabis. For me, I like recommend people try to achieve it, or at least follow the practices, because it makes you very competitive in an international market. When we start to see other countries legalize and open up, Canada is obviously going to be somebody who is a recognized world leader, but even when I source ingredients internationally, I require that they're HACCP certified at a minimum as part of my supplier approval. So I'm going to imagine that it's going to be the exact same thing when edibles come into play, that you can sell to Europe and sell to Australia and all over the world. So I think that it's important that people kind of hop on that as soon as they can, and that requirement for kind of HACCP at a minimum has been in the food industry for a really long time. So if you're ever trying to predict where you're going to be landing, if you're doing edibles or extracts in the next year or two, just take a look at what we're doing in food, and you can be pretty much sure you're going to see all those things rolling out in the next 5 years.
Yeah, that's very, very accurate indeed in terms of the CFIA has established a much more encompassing list of requirements, and in cannabis we've kind of have seen a tailored version of the preventative control requirements, and essentially it's fixated on hazard analysis. So is there a standard step-by-step process that companies should follow, do you think, when kind of shaping up their hazard analysis process? Any tips?
Well, I definitely recommend kind of the basic major areas. So if it's the first time you're doing it, the 3 kind of major sections are definitely just the identification. You can't control a hazard if you haven't identified it. And that's where things like the RDHI come in handy. Really, for me, how I do identification is I actually go through all of the inputs, so all the raw ingredients, all of the packaging materials as well, anything that's really in contact with the product or part of the product. And then I also go through the processes as well. This kind of lets me hit everything twice. And don't feel bad if you don't catch all the hazards the first time. This can take weeks, months, realistically speaking, if you have a lot of complex things to go through and get everything together. And then the second part would just be classifying your hazards. You really only have 2 piles they can fall into: acceptable and unacceptable, and that's the level of risk that they have. Ideally, you want to have all your hazards that have an unacceptable level of risk controlled down to a point where you feel that you're comfortable with them. And how you determine that is on the probability of the hazard, so what is the likelihood that it occurs, and the severity, so how severe is the injury. Something that would cause death, for example, or severe injury is going to be something that more likely has an unacceptable level of risk, even if the likelihood is fairly low, compared to something else that's not as dangerous. And then last but not least, of course, figuring out the controls that make sense, and just keeping in mind that I don't like this expression because I'm a cat lover, but there's hundreds of ways to skin a cat. There's not one set way to control a hazard. There are dozens and dozens of options on how you want to do that. So I'm sure Troy has had to look at several options for sanitation programs that make sense, and they're not always going to be the same for every single company.
100%. It's always has to be tailored. As you mentioned, everyone's doing something different, or at least they're trying to be different than everyone else. So there's no cookie cutter SOPs or plan that'll work for everyone.
Right. Yeah, it really ultimately comes down to how you can defend your program, your level of comprehension in terms of how you've justified critical control points, how you've addressed different hazards throughout your process flow. There is some flexibility, certainly in PCP, when given the fact that it is so writing intensive, but ultimately it does come down to the licensed producer, for example, in terms of how they're establishing and monitoring and verifying their critical controls and risks assessments, whether it's incoming, receiving of products, and all the way to products leaving their facility for shipments. We spoke briefly a little bit about the HACCP certification. What's the difference between HACCP certificates and a GMP distinction? Could you elaborate a little bit on the 2 of those?
Yeah, so HACCP, for example, you kind of touched on a little bit, but it's hazard analysis and critical control. So that really is at its core like a food safety program, whereas GMP is something that I find people get pretty confused with because it stands for Good Manufacturing Practices, which are actually just a type of PRP, which is a prerequisite program. So in the HACCP certification, you have to have prerequisite programs as part of your HACCP. Whether or not those are GMP, it's not a requirement that they're GMPs. There are other PRPs that meet that qualification, but you need to have something in place like GMP, a PRP basically that is sort of the basic assurance that your manufacturing is being done that will produce a consistently safe product. But you can have both certifications, GMP or HACCP. Usually it's recommended you'd have GMP first, so you cover off your PRP requirements, and then HACCP on top of that. But you can get a HACCP certification without a GMP certification.
Right. And lastly, when implementing a PCP or HACCP program in your cannabis facility, who is ultimately responsible for overseeing and improving the final product?
The quality assurance person.
Yeah.
But really, it should be the whole team, though. Like the quality assurance person is going to be the one who gets the finger pointed at them if anything happens. That's kind of what happens in the cannabis facilities. But there should be a team around it, and they should all be involved and really should all feel their responsibility. If I was on the team, I would know. I would want to be checking in, and things change really fast in cannabis facilities. Even especially in the last year with coronavirus, I know that even gowning rooms and whatnot, they've been changing. So it's always a good idea to go back and look. You might have changed your gowning room, and maybe they're sitting on a wicker chair, and that wicker chair can bring in a piece of wood into the facility, just as like an example, or could rip your PPE. So it's really, really important to monitor it too. I know we touched on that, but I've seen a lot of issues happen when things have changed and they haven't been documented and looked at.
Yeah, the quality assurance person ultimately has the final say, but like you said, Troy, the whole team really has to come together. And certainly during an audit, for example, it's expected that everyone is familiar with the processes and ultimately that product there's a mutual understanding that product, once it leaves our facility, is in good standing and is safe for the consumer. Do you guys have anything to add before we end the panel?
I would just say, if no matter what you're doing in the facilities, keep an eye out and don't be afraid to report anything that you see. I've seen hazards that were identified that some people in the facility might have been aware of and just didn't report it. So if you see something, tell someone. You should know who's on your team or the HACCP team. Let them know, and you'll might be get rewarded or be a hero for doing that.
Yeah, like Troy said, it's super important. I mean, we just talked about, who the responsibility of HACCP or any kind of, food safety or product safety program is. It really is typically on the quality assurance team. If it's HACCP, you might actually have a HACCP coordinator who is the head of the HACCP team, but it is on everybody in the facility. It's better to have 100 eyes on the process than, just a handful of people on the QA team that are helping out. The other thing that I would recommend for people is just to take it step by step. Doing your PCP for the first time, especially if you haven't had experience with it, it can seem overwhelming. Even when I teach the courses and my class is doing their examples and they're doing one product and they say, there's like 50 hazards here. It seems like it's a lot, and it is, but that's what we're here to do, and that's why Canada has such a fantastic food safety program, and that's why cannabis edibles in Canada are going to be one of the best in the world. It's because we do these really detailed assessments using, these internationally recognized principles to make sure that everything is covered. So it is overwhelming. It is a lot of work. It can take, months to get everything really under control, but just keep kind of hacking away at it. Don't be surprised if new hazards get uncovered. And also don't be surprised when you have this perfect plan that you finished and everything looks great, and then you go on the floor and you realize you either missed a bunch of hazards or you put a bunch of controls in place that don't make sense. That's one of the biggest things that people get really upset about, because they put so much work in, but in theory and practice are two different things, and just take it in stride.
Yeah, absolutely. Good news has to travel fast, and bad news has to travel faster. So if you do identify any additional hazards or missing procedures that you think that should be in place, certainly bring that to the attention of the team. And like you guys also said, it takes time to build out a program in its entirety, and it can seem very overwhelming. And the step-by-step approach that you had mentioned is key. I think getting procedures approved in place, even if you have 10 to, I don't want to say 100, but 10 to 20 revisions, start building the understanding of what that procedure is trying to do. It's not going to be perfect right away. So get it approved, get it at the floor level, start seeing how it actually is functioning within your facility, and then go from there with revisions and further discussion. So I think I think we've shed a lot of light on the differences between the two approaches, PCP and HACCP. We've discussed some great similarities, a lot of differences between the two, and I think we've even done a good job in explaining and kind of backing the regulatory requirements and the differences between HACCP and PCP in the context of the food industry and also in the cannabis industry. So with that being said, we'll catch you guys in the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both.